What happens when an elderly man is kicked out of his own grandson's graduation ceremony? They thought he was just an old man. But 10 minutes later, armored cars pulled up, and the entire hall fell silent. Harold Bishop woke up to the sound of a draft blowing through the front door. The old trailer stood crooked, warped like his back. There had been no electricity since nightfall, the circuit breaker had tripped, and he had long since sworn off crawling under the chassis. His knees no longer bent, and in the dark he might bump into a rat or his own bad thoughts instead of the fuse. He made himself a weak cup of coffee, the last of the instant, scraped out of the corner of the jar with a spoon, and drank it standing, looking out the window at the slow June dawn. Orange light seeped through the slanted blinds, but it gave off little warmth. His left shoulder blade burned. It wasn't a wound, it was a memory. A jacket hung on the coat rack. It was woolen, from someone else's shoulder, long since faded. Inside was a purple heart medal, pinned there not for show, but for himself. To remember, yes, he had survived. Yes, it was worth it. And now he was going because not going would be even worse. Today was his grandson's graduation. Jack. 16 years old, and already a stranger. He hadn't been particularly close to him before, but after what happened with Hannah, his daughter, with whom he communicated more through fragments of memories than over the phone, everything had become colder than the batteries in his trailer. But Harold didn't want to prove anything. He just wanted to stand somewhere in the back. To see the boy who looked like his father accept a piece of paper with a ribbon on it. That's all. No speeches, no hugs, no tears. Just being there. Sometimes it's enough just to stand by someone's side. He walked there. The car was parked in the grass, overgrown like a dinosaur skeleton. 2 months ago, the steering wheel had jammed, so he had put the keys in a drawer and never touched the car again. It was less than an hour's walk to school if he didn't rush. But he hadn't been in a hurry for a long time. The school greeted him like a stranger. The entrance glistened with balloons, signs, and smugness. People were dressed up and noisy, women in colorful dresses, men in open shirts, children in costumes that had been tailored to fit them from Pinterest. Everyone spoke loudly so that everyone could hear how proud they were. Harold held a small bag in his hands, inside was a watch. Not fashionable, not smart, not for TikTok. Just an old watch that had survived shelling, flooding, and divorce. He wanted to give it to Jack. To say, "You're a grown-up now. Time is the only thing they'll take away from you." At the entrance, he was stopped by a security guard. He was in his early 20s, with a walkie-talkie and a superior attitude. "Excuse me, sir, we have a list." "I have an invitation," Harold said, pulling out a folded piece of paper, neatly signed by his grandson. The guy glanced at the paper and smirked as if he had seen a cassette tape on Spotify. "That's the old version. He's not in the new one. It's my grandson's graduation." "I understand, sir. But if you're not on the list," while they were talking, a woman approached. The head teacher. Her smile was as sharp as soap in the eyes. "Mr. Bishop, let's not spoil the party. We're sure your grandson loves you, but maybe you should give in. Things are strict here." Harold stood there. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just breathed. Whispers began to rise around him. "Is that the veteran?" "Yeah. Homeless, I think." "Who let him in?" He didn't see his grandson. He didn't hear his name being called from the podium. He didn't even feel his daughter's gaze. The clock in the bag was ticking. His fingers turned white. And inside, everything that hadn't burned before was now burning. He walked away from the school as if he were leaving a fire. Not because of the smoke, but because he couldn't breathe. His feet stepped on the asphalt as if on thin ice, one step and a crack, another step and emptiness. Something inside him was contracting, as if from bad water. But he held on. Harold always held on, that was the problem. He held on even when it would have been better to fall. He reached the next street and sat down on a bench near the bus stop. His back ached like an old radio, dull and strained. A plastic bottle lay nearby, and the sign for a store was reflected in a puddle, family discount, the letter I burned out. The air was thick with sun, noise, and other people's happiness. He took a notebook out of his inside pocket, an old leather one with cracked edges. There was a single sheet of paper inside. It had been written at night, when the trailer was creaking and his thoughts were falling apart. He was going to give the letter to his grandson. There was nothing superfluous in it. Nothing about the war. Nothing about military service. Just a few lines about how love is not words, it is when you stand by someone even when they have turned away. You must not be like me, he wrote. But if one day you realize that only a shadow remains of you, know this, you are not alone. Harold reread these words over and over again. And he thought, was it worth it? Who needs an old man's thoughts now? In a world where everyone has screens, who listens to someone who just sits there silently? A car with open windows drove by on the left. The music blared like resentment. Young voices, laughter, clapping, and not a single glance in his direction. It was as if he were in a different layer of air. One where it was impossible to breathe. The bench beneath him creaked. He closed his eyes for a moment. And then he heard it. A dull rumble. At first, like a distant thunderstorm. Then closer. Louder. Not a car. Not music. He knew that sound. Even after decades. The noise of engines, heavy and massive, like decisions that cannot be reversed. And something straightened inside Harold. Not his body, his memory. He stood up. Not quickly. Slowly, as if something inside him was deciding whether it was worth it. He raised his head. And he saw them. 3 vehicles. Painted a dirty green, with scuffed sides. Not new. Not shiny. But he knew who they were. By their gait. By their gaze. By the way they stood. This was no parade. No show. These were his people. Those standing in uniform by the armored vehicles weren't fussing about. They weren't waving their arms or putting on a show. They were just standing there. Straight. Calm. Harold immediately recognized Travis among them. He was bald now and had a belly, but his shoulders were the same. His jaw looked like it was carved out of brick. They hadn't seen each other in a long time. Too long. One of the soldiers approached. He was wearing a black t-shirt and army boots. No insignia. He looked at Harold and nodded slightly. Harry. We heard you were here. Harold narrowed his eyes slightly. And who ratted you out? The internet. Jack wrote something somewhere. You know we keep tabs on our people. Harold didn't answer. He just stood there, as if he had forgotten how to talk. We saw how they turned you in. That, the soldier pointed toward the school, won't do. I'm not for them. I'm for him, all the more reason. Travis stepped closer. His eyes were almost transparent, like someone who had been through too much and now looked not at you, but through you. He held out his hand. Harold didn't shake it. He just nodded. That's what people who have buried someone do. We'll give him the letter, Travis said. He has to get it. You think he'll read it? I don't think he'll forgive us if he doesn't. They started toward the school. They walked slowly. Silently. The crowd at the entrance first stepped back, then began to film. Cell phones rose like machine guns. The vice principal, the one with the fake politeness, was already running toward the security guard. Who are they? Why didn't anyone tell us? But no one could stop anything. Harold stayed at a distance. He didn't go with them. It was enough for him that they were going. One of the guys passed the package with the watch through a side entrance. A young guy from the graduating class helped him. He said he knew Jack. That was all. No speeches. No drama. Just a handover. Just as it should be. Inside the school at that moment, the presenter faltered when the loud rumble of armored vehicles made the windows rattle. People in the hall began to stand up. Jack sat on the edge. He looked out the window. And froze. The ceremony continued. Names were called out one after another. But something had already changed. Not for everyone, but for one person for sure. In the schoolyard, there was a haze, not from dust or cigarettes, but from the summer heat, rotten grass, and heated shame. Outside, everything looked festive, but in this corner, the air trembled with tension. Harold stood to the side, motionless. It was as if he had been nailed to the ground. He knew this wasn't his day, his place, or his stage. And yet, he was here. Just standing there. An old man in a threadbare jacket, his hands frozen at his sides. A boy approached him, the same graduate who had handed him the gift. Tall, with shaggy bangs and a face that didn't yet know what would become of him in 10 years. "He'll read it, Mr. Bishop. He was very serious when I gave it to him." "Sometimes silence is louder than words," Harold replied quietly, looking at the ground. "He's a lot like you." "I thought you were brothers." Harold snorted. "My knees are half a century older than him." Travis appeared from around the corner. He was holding a cap in his hand. Harold looked at it. "His?" "Yes." "He took it off. He said he wanted you to know that he saw. And he understood." The old man took the cap. He rubbed the stiff brim with his fingers. "Did you see it in his eyes?" "Surprise. And something, like respect. He just didn't know you were coming. I didn't know myself. Until morning." They sat down on the concrete curb. Two old men, one with a heart like a battle shirt, all scarred. The other with a soul wrapped in silence. "You know," said Travis, "that graduation made me shiver." "Why?" "Because it was like it wasn't about us. It's about another generation. About those who live as if no one owes them anything, and they don't, yes. But we're not trash either." A teenager in a suit walked by, staring at his phone. "Not a word, not a glance." "There. That's what I'm talking about," Travis nodded. "Maybe he's just afraid to look," said Harold. "In case he sees what he could become." They fell silent. Somewhere around the corner, someone was clapping. Names were being shouted. But in this quiet corner, everything was much louder. He didn't notice when Jack approached. No loud words, no camera, no mom, he just appeared. He stood about 3 meters away, as if unsure whether he could come closer. His jacket was a little too big for him, his tie was askew, and his eyes were not those of a boy. Not today. Harold raised his head. They looked at each other as if they were seeing each other for the first time. No tears. No movie dialogue. Just a steady, firm gaze, as if there had been no years of silence between them. Jack took a step. Then another. And hugged him. Not tightly, not desperately, just genuinely. As if with this gesture he was trying to say, "I understand everything. I haven't forgiven everything. I haven't accepted everything. But I understand, that's for sure." Harold slowly hugged him back. His arms were wooden, as if they weren't listening to him. But they held him tight. He whispered in his ear, "You'll be fine. Just go and don't turn away." From anyone, Jack said nothing. But he stayed standing there. 2 minutes. Maybe 3. Time doesn't tick in moments like that, it breathes. Voices could be heard behind him. Someone was calling Jack, probably for a photo, for the stage, for a family portrait. But he didn't go. He just sat down next to Harold on the curb. As if nothing had changed. And yet, everything had changed. Travis stood a little to the side, smoking. "Well, it's definitely time," he said, exhaling smoke. Harold nodded. "Thanks for coming. Thanks for not giving up." Jack stood up. He looked at his grandfather, then at the armored cars. "Are they all yours?" "No," Harold smiled. "They're my brothers. Even if they all have different seals on their papers." They shook hands. Without ceremony. Just like men. Like those who know this could be their last meeting. When Harold was alone, he picked up his cap and looked inside. There was a note. Small, folded in half. "I didn't know. But now I do. Thank you for coming. Signed, Jack." He didn't smile. But inside, something softened. He took his time on the way back. Cars were still parked outside the school, balls were hitting the hoods in the wind, someone was setting up a tripod, children were tugging at their parents, "Let's go already." All this hustle and bustle was like a fly in a jar, there was noise, but no meaning. Harold turned into an alley and sat down on a concrete curb where schoolchildren used to smoke. From there, he couldn't see the scene or hear the speeches, but it smelled like reality, old paint, hot asphalt, and something rotten that's always around backyards. He stared into space. He was just processing. Not the event, not the gestures, not the meeting. Just the fact, he was there. They hadn't erased him. They hadn't forgotten him. At least one person hadn't forgotten. He took out the watch. The very one. He held it in his palm as if he were holding someone else's life. He had wanted to give it back in person, place it in their hand, say a few words. And now it was back in his hands. Only now it had a different meaning. "Did you see how he looked?" a familiar voice asked. It was Travis, smoking again. "I saw. But I didn't understand." "You don't have to understand. It's not a formula. It's an encounter." He hardly spoke. "And you don't have to. Sometimes silence is the best way to avoid making a mistake." Harold sighed. "You know what I'm afraid of?" "What?" "That he'll forget everything. In a month, in a year. That it's all just a flash in the pan. And we'll go back to being, well, museum exhibits. Loud, dusty, and useless. Maybe he will forget. But while he hasn't, you're alive. And he's not alone." They were silent for a moment. Something clinked on the roof, perhaps a seagull or a balloon that had come loose. Harold ran his finger along the edge of the clock face. There was a tiny chip. He remembered it. It was history. Only now, it was the future. In the evening, he returned to the trailer. The metal door clicked like a sick dog's tooth and hung on one hinge. It was stuffy inside, smelling of old tin, dust, and things that had long since ceased to live, only existed. A cold mug stood on the stove, next to a can of food that had been opened 2 days ago. He didn't touch it. He sat down at the small table by the window, wiped the plastic with his palm, and looked out onto the street. Nothing new, a couple of bushes, a dilapidated fence, the neighbor's cat, limping but proud. He took out the letter. The one he hadn't had time to deliver himself. And suddenly he realized, now it was useless. Because he had already said everything he needed to say. Not with words. With his gaze, his hands, simply with his presence. But he couldn't throw it away. He folded it neatly, put it in an envelope, and placed it next to his medal. Not as a trophy. As a reminder, there was a time when words had weight. He lay down on the couch and put his hands behind his head. The springs in the back creaked, his body ached. But something inside was quieter. Not calmer, just quieter. He didn't feel victory or joy. Just that strange feeling when the pain hasn't gone away, but it's no longer the main thing. There was a dull knock at the door. He didn't immediately realize it wasn't the wind. He got up and opened it. Hannah was standing in the doorway. The very same. With dark circles under her eyes and lips that had long forgotten how to smile. In her hands was a paper bag. Inside was food. Simple food. "I didn't know how to say it," she breathed. "Sometimes you don't have to say anything," he replied quietly. "I thought you were upset." Resentment is for those who still have the strength to argue. She came in. Sat down. Looked around. "Everything is the same here." "But I'm not." He poured her some water. He didn't pour himself any. They were silent. The silence wasn't oppressive. It just was. And perhaps there was more forgiveness that evening than in all the apologies of the past 20 years. A few days later, he was sitting at the bus stop again. Not because he was going anywhere. Just because the air was there. Not sterile, not air-conditioned, but real, smelling of dust, gasoline, and deception. He was holding a bag of oranges. One was already moldy, but he didn't want to throw it away. The bench beneath him was wobbly. His neighbor, a local drunk named Joe, was snoring softly, buried in a newspaper from 2 years ago. The sun beat down on his temples like a nail in a tree, but Harold didn't complain. He just sat there. Waiting. For what? Hell if he knew. When you're in your 60s, you often sit around not because you have to, but because there's nothing else to do. A young man approached him. About 25 years old. Athletic, with a haircut from a barber shop, but with eyes that made him look uncomfortable. Harold recognized him immediately. It was the security guard. The very same one. The guy fidgeted like an undercooked omelet. "Mr. Harold, right? Let's say so. I just wanted to say that, no, don't. No, I have to. You were doing your job. I was doing mine. Standing up for someone." The guy nodded. He lowered his eyes. He took something out of his pocket. Candy. Regular mint candy. He put it down next to him. "It's nothing, really. Just something. Thanks. I don't eat mint. But I appreciate it." The guy left. He didn't say, sorry, or goodbye. And that was right. Because sometimes it's better to just walk away. Without making excuses. Harold took the candy. He rolled it around in his hands. Then he put it in his pocket. Not because he wanted it. But because even a small gesture is a bridge. He woke up early in the morning. Light poured into the trailer through cracks between the panels, and streaks of sunlight danced across the floor. Everything was as usual. The coffee maker didn't work, the radio was silent, the refrigerator wheezed but didn't freeze. And yet, something was different. There was a card hanging on the door. Someone had carefully taped it with adhesive tape. A white rectangle with uneven edges, inside was a photo, Jack standing at the entrance to the college, against a red brick background. In his hands was that very same watch. The smile on his face wasn't for the camera. It was real. Almost grown up. Almost confident. Below the photo were a few lines written by hand. "Vacation is coming soon. I'll come home. Tell me the story about the medal. I want to know everything." Harold held the postcard as if it might disappear. Then he put it on the table where the pill bottles and army clippings had been. He didn't smile. But his body felt lighter. Like after a long winter, when you suddenly step out into the sun for the first time and feel that it's not just light, but warmth. He picked up his notebook. The same one. He took out a pen. And began to write. Not because he had to. But because there was something inside him that needed to come out. He didn't write about his military exploits. He didn't recall how blood smelled in the morning dust. He didn't draw enemies, heroism, or banners. He wrote about how he once sat on the porch with his daughter when she was still very young, and she asked, "Why are adults always angry?" And he didn't know what to say then. But now he knew. He wrote about how he was afraid to look his own grandson in the eyes. How he thought he was too late. And then he realized that if you're still breathing, you still have time. By evening, he had finished the first page. Then the second. By the third, his hand was no longer shaking. Outside, someone was kicking a ball around. Laughter. Shouts. And inside the trailer, there was order. Not perfect. But alive. If this story touched you, write the word "was" in the comments. Because sometimes, just being there means more than any words. Tell us about someone you once supported, or who once supported you. Ultra-realistic image of an elderly veteran in a faded suit, standing alone behind a high school fence, holding a small gift bag with old military watches inside, watching a graduation ceremony from a distance. Ultra-realistic image of 3 military-style armored vehicles quietly pulling up to the back of a modern school during a graduation event, veterans in plain clothes stepping out with silent determination. Ultra-realistic image of a young graduate and an elderly man sitting side by side on a concrete curb behind the school building, hands resting on knees, sharing a quiet moment without speaking. With a summer sunset behind them, ultra-realistic image of an old trailer home interior, dimly lit, with a cracked window, a handwritten letter on the table next to a military medal and a photo of a smiling boy holding a pair of old watches. Ultra-realistic image of a teenage boy walking away from a graduation crowd, holding his grandfather's military cap in one hand, looking back with a serious and thoughtful expression, while the celebration continues in the background.